Hi, I'm Ryan Moody. Thank you for joining me. I am starting a series on the book of Romans, and this is really just kind of an introduction today, just a quick overview. And the book of Romans is my favorite book in the whole Bible, and I've been studying the Bible for 35 years, and very intently, and a lot of study hours have gone into the scriptures, especially the book of Romans. And so I'm going to go over this book in this series, but it's not going to be a verse by verse study. I'm basically going to take certain passages from each chapter, and then I'm going to expound upon them. So if it was verse by verse, this would just be a really long series. And then not only that, I don't understand every verse in Romans. I don't pretend to understand everything in the scriptures. But some of the things I do have a good grasp on, and those particular passages are what I'm going to teach on. I'm not going to dare to try to teach on something that I really don't understand. I'd rather just leave it alone. But so we're going to start off just a really quick overview and looking at starting at verse 16. Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ." Now, what you'll hear most people say is that the theme of this letter to the Romans is righteousness, or righteousness by faith, or something like that. But I disagree with that. I think that can be a theme of it, but I think the true theme of this letter that Paul wrote to the Romans is the gospel of Christ. This letter that I've come to find from studying it for so many years, it is Paul explaining to us the gospel message that Christ himself preached. Now we know that that's what he's talking about when he says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ." He's not just talking about the gospel about Christ. Yes, it is the gospel which is about Christ, but he's talking specifically about the gospel that Jesus Christ himself preached. And we know that because in the last chapter of the book, at almost the very end, the very last verse, in verse 25, he says, "Now to him," Romans 16:25, "Now to him that is a power to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ." See, the preaching. He says, "My gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ." Now that term, "my gospel," it's found here, and then it's also found in chapter 2 in Romans. And what Paul simply means by "my gospel," he's just simply distinguishing the fact that he is the apostle that was sent to the Gentiles. And that's who he's writing to, the Romans, and really all of his letters are written to Gentiles. That's who he was sent to. So his gospel was a special message that Christ gave to him to take out to non-Jewish people, to the Gentiles. And so that's what he means by "my gospel." Well, back in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ." Now, something Christ himself said, and this is really taking from exactly what Christ said in Luke 9, verse 26. Jesus himself said, "For whosoever shall be ashamed of me and of my words," see, his gospel, ashamed of him and of his gospel, his words, "of him shall the Son of Man be ashamed, when he shall come in his own glory and in his Father's and of the holy angels." And so when Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel," he is saying that he was not ashamed to preach exactly what Christ preached and to preach exactly what Paul himself was sent to preach as an apostle. He was not ashamed to stand up for the truth and to preach the true message. Not to preach something else that would give him favor with people or would keep him from getting persecuted or something along that lines. He was not ashamed to preach exactly what Christ preached and what Christ sent him to preach, regardless of what happened to him in the process. He was willing to stand for it, preach it to his death. And so that's what he's saying. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth or trusteth, is what that word also means, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. And we know that the gospel went out to the Jews first, right? In Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, Peter preached a message, and it was Jewish people only that heard that message and came to Christ. And in the early days of the church, it was only Jews that were coming to serve the Lord, that were hearing the gospel, and that were coming to salvation. So the gospel message that Christ preached, it did go out to the Jews first, but then it also went to the Greeks, or Gentiles in general. And so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop this lesson, and we're going to pick up next time and go from there. This is just simply a brief overview to get us started, to establish the fact that this book of Romans, it is explaining to us in detail the message that Christ preached. So if we want to understand the gospel message, the true gospel by which we can be saved, we need to understand this book of Romans, because this is Paul going into great detail about it and explaining it to us. And much of Romans, we can go back and see things that Christ preached and see what Paul is actually explaining. So there's I guess you'd say he's taking from things that Christ actually preached, we have recorded in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then you can see how he's taking those things and really explaining them in detail, is what I'm trying to say. And so we're going to go forward with this, and let me also say that in my series videos on YouTube, I have the comments closed, but I would like to hear from you. If you want to reach me, please do. You can go to my website. My website is understandingscripture.net, www.understandingscripture.net, and there's a tab that has contact, and just go to that, and it has my email address, and write to me if you have a question, complaint, whatever it is. Just write to me. I'd like to hear from you. Touch base with me. So thank you for joining me, and until next time, may God richly bless you. Thank you.